Hey gang, today's episode is brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/nakeddiner. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hey gang, I know this is a weird place to cut in the middle of the intro music and all, but I really feel like this is something I need to do for this episode. If you're used to what me and Andy do, you're used to us joking around, having a lot of fun, a lot of good times, some laughs, that kind of thing. This episode isn't necessarily like that. This episode gets a little dark. In fact, not even a little dark. It gets pretty dark. So I'm not somebody who's a fan of the phrase trigger warning, but I just really feel the need to put this out there right now. If you're somebody who has experienced childhood trauma, childhood abuse, that kind of thing, we're not going to feel bad if you skip this episode. Come back next week. We have somebody who is a comedian who does Disney Carnival cruises. It'll be light and fun and happy, and we still love you, and we won't, feel bad if you skip out on this episode because you don't think you're emotionally there to handle it. All right, there, I said my piece. Let's get back to it. Welcome to another episode of The Naked Diner, everyone. I'm Jack. It is episode 23, where we have guest Mr. M. Dolon Hickmon, author of 1324. And with me, as always, is my inimitable co-host,
Andy Hall. Was that my cue? We're all going on a little journey of darkness, maybe into the heart of darkness this episode. So, hey.
Way better than
Good
Apocalypse
times.
Now.
What's that?
Heart of Darkness. It's way better than Apocalypse Now. So, Andy, this week we're going to talk about some pretty dark stuff.
Yep, we are.
Fans of the show will remember way back in episode 4, we talked to Peter Mosley about the Gothard method. Gothard? Doesn't matter. Gothard is the way that you can spell it to find out more on the internet. But he's one of those Christian parenting, spare the rod, spoil the child types. And Dolon, coming from a similar background, and wrote this novel. It's not autobiographical, but there's a lot of autobiographical content in it, I think it's safe to say.
Yes, we'll be exploring that particular topic with him.
Yeah. Difference being that Dolon is coming from the How to Train Up a Child school, the authors of that being good personal friends of the Duggars.
Now, I don't want to give it away, but for those of you who aren't acquainted with How to Train Up Your Child, the book, there are beatings involved. There's just, I don't know, chastening rods. There's dowels. There's belts. There's all kinds of craziness.
Rulers for babies.
What is up with that? That's crazy.
So before we get into this, Andy, in lighter news, we had a really good week last week.
We have.
We got some lovely press mentions in Split Cider and Huffington Post.
Woo!
Very, very nice.
It's definitely worth reading. It's a very
we would say that.
Well, I think you underestimate my ability to sabotage anything good that happens to me. And unfortunately, we just happen to be sharing the same boat on this, my friend. So
something nice happened, Andy. Don't fuck this up for me.
You know what? I am going to say the review was about a particular episode that we did with Allison Chadwick, which is the one just before this. And I don't want to... Yeah, I guess this is what are we? It's an interview show. The Naked Diner is an interview show, and we're both pretty funny people. But I don't know if I would put it as and we have comedians on, but there's something about being labeled as like a comedy show. I don't know. It just doesn't sit well with me.
We're not alone in this. It's not like Cracked and Marin don't deal with heavy subject matter from time to time.
Do they have a hot dysfunctional mess category?
I think that's called personal journals.
Personal journals. Well, if there was an anti-personal
boom, iTunes
journal.
Category slam.
Just like that.
And if you haven't noticed, that means you're not following me or Andy on Twitter. So at Lead Flashing and at Laugh Purgatory, go follow us on Twitter.
Yeah, you can go on my blog, Laughing in Disbelief. I do all kinds of funny things there. fake stories. I share a lot of content from previous guests on the Naked Diner there, and it's a hoot. I don't know if a hoot is short for hootenanny. I don't really know what a hootenanny is, but there is a lot of fun on Laughing in Disbelief.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of other podcasty stuff at zxh-creative.com.
There is.
Which is also where our shop is. Folks, if you go over to zxh-creative.com/shop, you can find a little Amazon shop we set up with all of our guests. Well, at least the ones who have stuff on Amazon. All the stuff that they have available for sale on Amazon, including this week's guest's book.
Hardcover and softcover.
Hardcover, softcover, ebook available. If you want to check out the book, you are free to do so. And we would really appreciate it if you did it through zxh-creative.com/shop, because then he gets his cut and we get our cut, and we don't have to bug you about this stuff as much.
That is correct. You know, Jack, I have a dream. Do you know what that dream is?
Financial independence.
I have a dream that at some point we will not be constricted to just doing 1-hour shows. Because as soon as you start doing more than 1-hour shows, it starts costing more money. So if we get more money coming in, we could actually do longer shows. That's what I think.
We could do longer shows, or we could do more shows.
And we're not talking about like incredibly good. We're just talking about
Good
covering
enough.
the expenses, you know? And yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. All right. So you ready? I know this is one of those subjects for you. So
It's one of my subjects. It's going to be one of those things.
all right. M. Dolon Hickmon, here we go.
Here we go. I am always in fear of hitting the stupid button. That's what I am.
Well, it's big and red, so that makes it easier.
It does. It's as if they want you to press that fucking button. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's always the easiest one to find, isn't it?
It is. It is. M. Dolon Hickmon, it's good to talk to you.
Well, I am a big fan of the show. It's nice to be talking back instead of just listening.
Oh,
That's-
thank you so much.
Yeah, that is nice. Thank you. This is,
We try.
see, I'm getting better at taking compliments. Jack and I were discussing this before the call went through. Exactly. And we just want to clarify our terms before I start butchering the word Rehoboam. How am I supposed to be pronouncing this without sounding like some kind of mook from Boston?
Well, that was pretty close. Rehoboam is the correct. Rehoboam.
Okay. Well, that's good. I feel better about that. I think, Jack, you were on the money with that.
I had a longer A at the end, but I was close.
Yeah, well, I'm not exactly an expert on ancient languages, so I may not be perfect.
Well, you're the authority here, my friend. And so we're going to go with what you say.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's correct. So we'll go with that. I found the name in a concordance and started using it, and really didn't need to know how to pronounce it until I started talking about the book. So I had to go and actually relearn, because I had been pronouncing it wrong in my head for quite a while by then.
Sure. That's not uncommon. There's a lot of words like that you read about, and then you actually start talking about it, and there's usually some smart ass around willing to tell you that you don't know anything because you're pronouncing an obscure word incorrectly.
Of course. So yeah, I have. It actually kind of touches on something that I was thinking, which is that I spent about 5 years working on my novel, and I wrote in isolation. I was not at that time, I had been doing some activism work earlier, but once I got the idea for the novel, it pretty quickly crowded out writing essays or anything else. And for, around 5 years, I was writing and not involved in any other activism. I wasn't, connecting with other people. So, one of the things that I said to myself at the beginning was I didn't want to follow, people who were failed writers who were out communicating with one another. And I thought, if they're not successful, I just don't want to associate with them. So I just kind of did my own thing in my own way. And, the result was that I had something that was interesting and unique, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that other people who are activists, would have written a different book. And if I had been in contact with them at the time, I might have done some things differently. But, I was really like the character in the story. I was, like a lot of people who have survived child abuse or any kind of trauma, really believing that I was the only one that had that experience. And so, that sense in a certain way also, really pushed me to get the work accomplished. If I had realized how many other people were out there doing similar things and were in a position to be more effective at it than I was, I probably wouldn't have started. And
Sure.
so in a certain way, it was actually a benefit, because I was just thinking, well, if I don't do this, then who will?
Right.
And, that was a big reason for me to keep working at it. I was not educated in how to write a novel. I had to learn how to write as I went along and, figure it out. And it was an arduous process, but, that sense of urgency that if I didn't sit down and actually do it, that it wouldn't get done is what really kept me pushing through.
Sure. Now, this isn't light material. This isn't puppies and rainbows kind of stuff in the book. What was it like? Because I get the image of you working in some kind of like pressure cooker, some kind of like emotional, mental pressure cooker for those 5 years as you're really delving into the material. How did that affect you during that time?
Well, it was not easy, but what was going on at that time is I was really having a mental breakdown and emotional crisis of my own. So it kind of starts with the fact that I'm not sleeping. Having PTSD, we can talk a little more about that, but when you've lived through trauma, one of the things that is a result of that is a set of symptoms that they call hyperarousal. And it means that I would often sleep as little as 1 to 3 hours a night. And eventually I kind of figured out that instead of, being awake and being miserable and being alone, I could sit and take those hours and use them, to accomplish something. A lot of the material that's in the book, it's not really autobiographical, but it is based on memories that I have. And so I was working already. I had a therapist who had assigned me to journaling, writing down these intrusive memories. And so a lot of material that wound up in the book had been earlier written, as journal entries and then reorganized as part of my therapy process. So I was not really starting, from scratch, but really, I got the idea for the novel. You really need a framework that lets you kind of take all of these disparate pieces and put them together into something that's interesting for people to read. But yeah, I mean, probably the hardest things for me to write were, delving into the scripture and the religious aspects of it, reading Christian parenting manuals and reading through the biblical, references that they use. And, that was probably the most stressful because it is a reminder of my childhood. Sure. And, brings out, it's what's the difference between that and everything else is that it really is real. When you're writing about this, there are still preachers that are still teaching this, and there are still kids that are living in that environment. And it's very hard, to separate yourself and feel comfortable. No matter how comfortable my life is now, it's always in the back of my mind that there are other kids out there that are living, in these situations and are waiting still for somebody to come and connect with them.
For people who aren't acquainted with this kind of parenting technique amongst some Christians and find it hard to believe that this goes on today, and I don't know if you get this question a lot, it's like the world that you have in your book, in this book, is it our world? Is it close to our world?
Well, I would say that, if you look around, look around the internet and you look at the reviews that are coming back to me from people who have read it, there are a incredible number of people who come back, read the book and say, this is exactly how it was when I was growing up. So, I think to some extent, people, one of the reasons for writing is that a lot of people are not aware that this is going on. It is a subculture of the American, general public, and it's a subculture of American Christians, but it is not by any means, strange in the sense of, being a group that no one has ever heard of or encountered. I mean, it's a group that it's a very large subculture that is millions of people. And like for instance, Vicky Garrison has come from the Quiverfold movement, which is connected to Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar and the TLC show 19 Kids and Counting, and they are advocates of the parenting guide written by Michael and Debbie Pearl, which is called To Train Up a Child. And that's a book that is one of the books that informed the Christian parenting manual at the center of my novel. But it's one of dozens, literally dozens over decades that have been written that say essentially the same things. And the Pearls are the most recent iteration, but what they're saying is not new or particularly different from what people like Roy Lessin were saying 30 years ago, or James Dobson has been saying going back 30 years, back to the 70s and 80s. So it's a subculture, but it's not like you've never met these people. They're on the radio, they're on TV, and they're present everywhere.
And just to be clear, what these manuals, from what I understand, say is basically treat your child in ways that you wouldn't even treat a dog.
Well, most people wouldn't treat an animal that way, but what I would say is that it comes from a biblical worldview that is based on authoritarian, patriarchy, and it's a male-dominated view. And you have God at the top, and then you have the father, you have the mother, and then at the bottom of the pecking order are the children. And one of the things, that I have evolved on since publishing the book is really in the understanding that, starting out, I thought, well, these religious leaders that are teaching this, they just must not understand how people are interpreting it and how damaging it is. And so if someone were to come and point out to them that these problems existed, then surely they would be eager to make, small changes that would make this, this teaching safer for other people. And in fact, what you find is that there is no desire on the part of these churches to modify any of their teaching, because the core, in my opinion, the core reason for it is that it's about religious indoctrination. And if a church could beat their adult members in order to secure obedience and to have automatic obedience and to have them accept and believe whatever the religious leader was saying, if they could beat adults into cooperating, they would. And
Sure.
Legally, they are not allowed, and they are using a loophole which allows parents to whip their children as a means of indoctrinating people to things that, otherwise, without the threat of, physical pain and violence, people would not accept. And so, when you delve into the rationalizations of people like Michael Pearl, and he's written at great length about why he teaches what he teaches, and the reason is that it's essential to their Christian indoctrination that you are allowed to use physical torture to break down the mind and the will of the person who is being indoctrinated, so that they will accept any outrageous statement that's coming from the pastor without questioning it. And so that, the political fight that's going on currently around all of this behavior is really a fight to the death for Christianity, because there's, it's very evident to the people who teach this that if they lose that tool, that their ability to engage in this indoctrination is going to be severely limited. And they can still do it to some extent, but not to the extent that they would like.
It really is kind of like a primer on how to induce Stockholm syndrome.
Well, I mean, it's a method of mind control. All religion is mind control. And I mean, from saying grace or, saying prayers or fasting, all of these are all tools that are used by, coercive leaders to break down a person's physical defenses, break down their psychological defenses, and make them more vulnerable to programming. When you look at it from that standpoint, it's a very ancient, system, and it was designed with the goal of inducing automatic obedience, and that's what it's for. To me, the thing that is the most horrific thing about it is, families that are lured in. To my mind, every religion is promising people a program of self-improvement. So no one joins a religion because they want to, harm their children or be immoral, but they're signing up thinking that they're going to become a better parent, they're going to become a better husband, they're going to become a stronger family and more moral. And unfortunately, the religion appeals to our better angels, the better part of our nature, but it is not what it presents itself as. And so once you get involved, you subject your children to this. And I was very fortunate that I had a protective mother, and she took steps to get my brother and I away from there. She tried harder than she probably should have to rescue the marriage in the process. But the number of people that I meet that are now adults and their families are still in these cults that teach, breaking the will of the child and teach these very severe forms of corporal punishment as a method of establishing. They consider it to be morality, but really what they're doing is they're inducing a phobia. So they're creating a psychological, a damaged psyche. And, to them, a person who doesn't have a phobia about breaking a religious rule is a person who doesn't have a moral center. To the religiously minded, and Michael Pearl has written about this on his website, and James Dobson writes about it. And what they're talking about is that what they consider to be morality is a feeling of terror that is left over from, when these rules were broken as children. They were subjected to severe, punishment that left them with an irrational fear. And it's one of I call it a trap door. It's a trap door that even as you're trying to leave the cult, that panic, the sense of fear, of punishment, that if I walk away from this religion, that, at some later time, I'm going to be facing my creator and having to answer for this behavior, is a very powerful thing. So they want to build that in when the child is, preferably a preschooler. You want to build in a terror of abandoning the religions. It induces dependency, and it is, it's all to the benefit of the religious institution and not to the benefit of the family or the child.
What will a child do when there is no way out?
Chris might have told you that his mother's boyfriend was strict, but he wasn't your run-of-the-mill evil stepfather.
Gracious, Chris, what are you doing out so late?
A shocking blitzkrieg of murder, conspiracy, and child abuse.
Publishers Weekly.
A grotesquely powerful tale that deserves to be read.
Heresy in the Heartland.
Who is Alan Garfield?
Depending on who you believe, he is either a celebrated Christian minister or the leader of a child abuse cult.
1324 by M. Dolon Hickmon. Available on Amazon.com.
You said that you have a brother. Is he older than you or younger?
My brother is 3.5 years older than me.
Was there a difference in how your father approached discipline to your older brother in regarding to you? Because I come, my sister, she's about 2 years older than I am, and she got the brunt of what was going on in my household when I was growing up. And being younger, I got to see what was going on firsthand, and I did a lot of duck and cover. So I didn't get half the stuff that she did. I didn't know if there's any kind of dynamic like that with your family.
Well, there was a difference because if you go and you look at the Christian parenting manuals, the thing about breaking the will is it says that you're looking for the child to make a broken cry. And Dobson and Pearl and all of these guys, they explain that you have to break the will of the child, and that this is going to be evident by a change in the tone or the sound of the way the child is crying. and it's described as a broken or a submissive whimper. So the difference between myself and my brother is that my brother had gotten old enough that he kind of realized that it really didn't matter a whole lot how you responded, whether you screamed and cried a lot or you were quiet. If you answered the questions, my father would read from the Bible while he was whipping us, and it was a quiz. I explain it to people as if you can imagine being the pilot of a plane that has an engine on fire, and there are hundreds of passengers in the back screaming in terror as the thing is, falling into the ocean. And you have a calculator and a list of charts, and you're trying to perform a piece of algebra that's going to save the plane. Trying to do that under the level of stress that is entailed and the fear of your own, imminent death is how it was. We were getting religious instruction, while being beaten to the extent that we were being injured, bleeding, severe bruising, and in fear for your life. And at the same time, trying to listen to Bible verses and understand the underlying philosophy so that you could answer questions. You had to not just answer, not just recite the verses back, but be able to develop new information from what you've been told to prove that you'd comprehended what was said. So the difference between my brother and I is that I really paid very close attention to what was being said, and I tried to understand what was being asked of me so that I could answer in a way that would make the punishment stop. My brother was 3.5 years further along in his education and had determined that there was really no point. So my brother wouldn't speak. He wouldn't cry. He would lay there like a bag of potatoes. And my dad would whip him until his arm was so sore, he'd switch the belt to the other hand. And the next day, my dad was not able, in some instances, my dad was not able to go to work because he had injured himself by exerting himself so much and whipping my brother. But, my brother really was just mentally dissociated. He was not present in the room. And so the conversation between him and I is my brother would tell me, that I should be quiet and not answer because anything that you say is going to make it worse. So the best thing to do is to say nothing. But my observation was that he seemed to actually get beaten quite a bit worse than I did as a result of not being responsive. So, there was some difference, but I mean, it's really, how different is it?
Sure. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that you get into in the novel, which I don't think it reflects your experience, talked at the top of the show about how you felt alone, and that drove your need to write the book.
Mm-hmm.
And what you get into in the book is how this kind of closed off, don't talk about it, let's not bring it up in society mentality and the closed off nature of these Christian cults allows for the fomentation of predators using this method as a form of sexual abuse.
Right. Well, that was, I'll tell you that I developed the idea for the story. And, we're having a lot of heavy conversation here. Doesn't sound very fun. And I want to say to anyone that's listening that the book is actually, it's a mix of a murder mystery. There's a rock and roll, there's a lead singer of a rock singer, and there's a lot of glamour, and the guy, there's a lot of fun aspects and elements that help to lighten the story so that you're not, stuck in this all the time. But I had struggled for a long time to come up with a way to tie it in to make a crime thriller out of the story as opposed to a fictional, child abuse memoir. And I came across a real life story where a group of men had been arrested for trading videos of children being brutally whipped with sticks and paddles and other things. And these were being traded through the mail. And what struck me at the time was the list of the occupations of the people who were arrested. It was a pastor of a church, and it was a principal or assistant principal of a school, and someone who was a scout troop leader. And as you look into it, what you find is these were all people who were in a position to be able to punish physically other people's children, and they had sought out, access to do that. And the thing that I really struggled as I was writing, not to have that be the central theme of the story, but really what occurs to me about all of that is that it is an issue. And as I was writing the story, I actually had the case of Robin Pagoria. She was a sheriff's deputy in Polk County, Florida, which is within an hour's drive of my home. She was arrested for she took a table and cut the legs off of the table and made an inclined spanking bench, and she would handcuff 2 female children that she had custody of to this bench, and she was whipping them while her online boyfriend, Christopher Lobbin, was a millionaire from Australia, was observing this, and they made recordings and she sent them internationally. Now, Christopher Lobbin, just this week, this has been going on for years, the case. He's been sitting in prison in Australia, and they just extradited him to the U.S., so he's going to be here in Florida, and I will be watching and writing about that case as they take it out. But there's been headmasters of schools that have been arrested for this. There's been scout troop leaders arrested for it. So this is something that I never really was aware of until I started doing research for the book. But then once you become aware of it, you find that it really isn't uncommon. All 50 states have laws that describe, erotic flagellation, which is whipping or spanking, as a form of sexual abuse. And, it's not on the books because it never happens. There's a reason why there's a law in place, and it's because if you're one of the authorities that's in charge of investigating these crimes, then it's something that you come across. It's not as, probably not as frequent as other forms of abuse, but it is present. But, it dovetails into a bigger concept, which to me does relate to my family. And that is that, in the case of somebody that is sexually aroused by dominating a helpless person, or by, inflicting suffering, someone who is sadistic. In that case, it's really evident that this person's reason for this behavior is not for the betterment of the child, for discipline purposes. It has an ulterior motive. But I think that in a lot of cases, if you scratch the surface in the situation of physical abuse, what you will find is that the parent who is physically abusive does derive some kind of they're meeting an emotional need that they have. It's not necessarily a sexual need, but there is a gratification that comes from that. And in our family, and also in the novel, what you can see is that even when the protective parent is protesting the mistreatment of the children, even when the authorities are investigating and the neighbors are complaining, these people continue and they persist in this behavior, even when it is causing them harm in the workplace, harm socially with their family, the grandparents, and so forth. And I think that it's a prevalent, situation that these are parents who are getting something emotionally, from the act of beating their child, and that it becomes to some extent like an addiction is something that the belief my parents were going to church and getting marriage counseling and family counseling while all of the abuse was going on. And persistently the belief of the pastor was that if you could teach, this is the belief of all of these writers, is that parents that are abusing their children physically need to be taught a right way to spank. And the problem with doing that is that it assumes that the parent is motivated to do it the right way. In the case of my parents, that was not the case. My father was not motivated to find a different or a better way to do what was there. He was motivated to do what he was doing because of the, whatever his internal sense of that was, it was necessary to him to do that. And, I'd say that if you look back 50 years, people used to think of a sexual abuser as being a guy in a trench coat that jumped out of the bushes. the idea of a physically abusive parent being an angry drunk or someone who is so enraged that they're out of control, that's a pervasive belief. And it really originates with the church. They have spent a lot of time telling people that the secret of not abusing your children is to not discipline in anger. But if you look at the statistical reality of what's going on with physical abuse, is that in most cases you really couldn't account for the systematic abuse of a child over years as being a result of rage or anger. If a person gets mad and they lash out, that's one thing. But when you see someone that's just systematically abusing their child, they can't be angry all the time.
Yeah.
If a kid is being beaten every day, 2 or 3 or 4 times a day, which is what you see in these cases. Michael Pearl's followers are, 3 or 4 of them now have been arrested for beating their children to death. And when the evidence emerges, what you see is that it wasn't done in a fit of anger. It was done methodically.
Mhm.
It was done coldly and calculatingly over a period of time. And so, that's really one of the central messages of the book, is that we need to stop as a culture accepting the idea that physical abuse is just a kind of discipline that's been taken too far. It isn't just discipline that's taken too far. It's something different where the parent is, satisfying some pathological emotional need by physically abusing their kid.
I'm sure that you've heard the saying a lot of addicts have, is that you can take a cucumber and pickle it, but once you have it pickled, you cannot unpickle the thing. You can't unpickle the cucumber. And the reason why I'm saying that is that people who've grown up in this kind of environment, because, abusers typically come from families of abusers. And so it's as if they're, and I noticed that you have some neurology or make references to this kind of addictive, compulsive behavior that abusers have, or people who have survived abuse have. It's like their brain changes a little bit. And it made me think about that saying that some addicts have about cucumbers and pickling.
Yeah, you can't go in reverse. Well, I'll say this, that, anger as a root cause of violence is very relatable. And so it's easy for a parent, if you have kids, and I have a daughter, she's 4 years old, and, almost any parent at some point is going to be so frustrated that you think to yourself, man, I'm so frustrated. I could just, strangle this kid or slap her or him or whatever it is. And so that's something that people relate to, but I don't think that it actually relates to people who are, religiously motivated child abuse is coming from a different location. And, if you look at Victor Vyeth is a well-known advocate for abused children. He works for the National Child Protection Training Center, and he is a advisor to the National District Attorneys Association. So one of the things that he writes about is how to prosecute successfully cases of physical abuse and overcoming there's a cultural bias that says that physical discipline is scriptural and biblical and beneficial. This is something that has to be overcome by attorneys who are looking at evidence that clearly indicates that abuse took place, but trying to get jurors to draw the distinction, it can be very hard. Mm-hmm. So Victor Vyeth defines 8 common physical abuse themes. And these are, if you're building a case against an abuser, almost all cases fall into one of the 8 themes. Now, out of those 3 themes, out of the 8 common physical abuse themes, 3 of them relate to anger. And so you're looking at the majority of cases, a prosecutor is not dealing with an anger issue when they're dealing with physical abuse. What they're dealing with is abusers' beliefs, for example, that beatings are justified under certain circumstances, or they may have the belief that if you hug your kid afterwards, if you express love and hug your kid afterwards, that this is going to make this all right. Mm-hmm. And so, when you get away from looking at anger as the cause of physical abuse, what you find is that really what's entailed is a lack of empathy. And so there's a lot of research done in this area, but Norma Feischbach is a emeritus professor and wrote for Cambridge University Press, and she describes the role of empathy in limiting child abuse, and she says parents should vicariously experience some degree of the pain and distress of the child who is the object of the physical violence. The empathic response should inhibit abusive behavior in the parent, since the abuse, by virtue of empathy, pains the parent as well as the child. Okay, now to boil that down in layman's speak, what it says is this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. And that's a common belief. But what happens is that when a physical abuser is abusing their kid, they are not empathetically engaged with that child's suffering. They have become disengaged from their own child's pain. And so they feel little or nothing. They're not angry. They're just rather unemotional. So the way that I could describe it, if you watch, there's a film called The Changeling, and it's kind of it's a meditation on the death penalty put together by Clint Eastwood. So he shows a serial child murderer chopping children up with an axe, and then at the end, the serial killer is hanged. And the response of the audience after an hour and a half of watching this serial child murderer do these horrific acts is that when you see him go off the gallows and twitch and squirm around as he dies, you really have almost no sense of feeling sorry for that murderer. And so this is something that religious institutions have incited in parents, is when you tell parents the statement that disobedience by a child is the equivalent of a person disobeying God. So when you disobey your parent, it's the same thing as Lucifer putting himself on the level of God and saying, I will be like the Most High. It's the sin of witchcraft. Well, what they've done is, with that hyperbole, they've taken a childish misdemeanor and they have elevated it until it's a crime against God. And now, in comparison to that, the suffering of a child who is being physically abused to the abusing parent does not warrant any empathy. The child is getting the punishment that they deserve. Right. So the anger is one way where people can lose their empathy. If you're angry, you can have a temporary reduction in empathy, but it's not the only way that people lose empathy for others. And some people are psychopaths or sadists, and they have no empathy at any time. Most people are going to be a empathetic person most of the time, but situationally you can lose your empathy. Another way that religion plays into defeating the empathy between parents and children is that if you say that a child who is in sin is dangling by a thread over the mouth of hell, okay, the child is in a state where if they were to die at this moment, their soul would be going to eternal torment. And so having elevated, again, that child's misdemeanor of whatever misbehavior they have to the point that now we have to look at the physical punishment in comparison to eternal torment and fire in hell. Well, compared to that, there's really no amount of beating. Even if the child's beaten to death, it's better that they die in the process than that they wind up eternally punished in hell. So, we're dealing with, a religious institution that essentially the religious leader takes the viewpoint that parents as a group are automatically too empathetic with their children, and that what's needed is an exhortation for them to not be so emotionally soft about discipline.
Right, because what they're doing is that they're turning beating a child into a heroic act.
Well, and the other thing is that these people do not know you never know who you're speaking to. So when you're giving parenting advice and you're starting with the assumption that parents don't want to hurt their kids, well, guess what? A lot of parents really have no problem with hurting their kids. So if you are starting with that assumption that you need to really, the assumption is that parents need to really be convinced of the utility and necessity of punishing. But in the case of a parent who is not in their constitution opposed to inflicting pain on the kid, what you're doing is you're throwing gasoline on a fire.
Sure.
And that's an issue. The other issue that I like to bring up is that in all of the discussion, when you're talking to religious people, they are going to always circle the conversation back to the fact that a parent who is listening to their advice should have a certain degree of maturity and intellectual understanding in order to understand that from these statements you should not take anything. Michael Pearl says, if anything in this makes you think that you should abuse your kid, then throw the book away. What they're overlooking is the Christian community is so oriented towards the parents that they're overlooking that in the communities where this is being preached, children are hearing it too. And that is one of the major themes in my novel, is about the reaction that the main character, Josh, has sitting in the church and hearing his father, who horribly physically abuses him, giving advice about how to whip your children to other people who are applauding his father for what amounts to his endorsement of this abuse. And the question is, if you're a pastor and you're standing in the pulpit and you're teaching, and you haven't considered, the rate of divorce among people in the church is the same as it is outside of the church. The rate of sexual abuse is the same. The rate of physical abuse is the same. So it means if you have a congregation with 200 people, there's essentially no chance that there is nobody in that church that is dealing with domestic violence or physical abuse. So when the preacher is talking about the line between corporal punishment and physical abuse, words like, this has to be done in love and not in anger, and all of these platitudes, they're boilerplate that excuse the church from responsibility. But could a 5-year-old make sense of that?
Yeah.
When a 5-year-old hears the pastor saying the blueness of a wound cleanses away evil, and the father who loves his son will chasten him often, these are things that children are going to automatically interpret in the light of their circumstance. And so to me, there's a huge problem for children that are reared in the church, that they are not being taught how to protect themselves, how to recognize abuse, and when to look for help. Instead, they are being, this is the anger that you see from survivors. So much of it is not directed at the church for giving their parent the idea of abusing them. It's directed at the pastor for failing to give to the young members of the congregation the information that they needed in order to get help for themselves. We were raised that if you were a good Christian and you were faithful, it meant that you put up with this. And that's a message that nobody should be getting.
You know what I want to do? I want to pivot a little bit. And reading through your book, which I just want to say that I did read through it and I found it very enjoyable. For someone who's written this is their first book, I thought it was structured very well. And even though there was a lot of heavy material in it, I didn't get bogged down. I felt that it was a good read. I got through it pretty fast. But I want to ask, who is King Solomon's press agent? Because that guy has gotten nothing but good press in the general society. And you start reading through your book and you say to yourself, what a jerk.
What a jerk. Yeah, well, that's one of the things is, to me, when you go in, I'll put it to you this way. If you have a car that works, then you don't need to know how it works. You just put the key in and you drive. But when your car is broke, now it becomes important to understand how all of the parts go together. So when I started reading through the Old Testament and trying to understand those biblical verses about, does the Bible advocate for corporal punishment, and is that something that is scriptural? I really was, at that time, I hadn't been attending church for years, but I wouldn't say that I was an atheist either. I was looking in the Bible because I was taught to believe that the answers were there if you looked. And what you find, though, is that there are 5 verses in the Bible that recommend corporal punishment or that relate to it. And all but one were written by the same person, which is King Solomon. And it's a significant fact because when we read into the history of King Solomon, what we find is that he really wasn't a very good father, and he was actually the epitome of a bad leader. And it's presented as if these were a list of accomplishments, but if you compare them to the rules for a king from Deuteronomy, what you see is that it really wasn't a list of accomplishments. It was a list of indictments against him. King Solomon married the daughter of the Pharaoh, and so he made as his queen. He was forbidden by God as the king to have any dealings with Egypt, and instead he married the Pharaoh's daughter. He was forbidden to have many wives, and instead he's known in the Bible as the king with the most wives of anyone. He was not to amass personal wealth, but it says that in his household that every utensil was gold and silver was so plentiful that people wouldn't even pick it up off the ground. And then, of course, the prohibition against marrying foreign women. He married foreign women. So this guy was really the epitome of a misuse of authority. And it comes to a head in the story of his son, Rehoboam, who is the character from the Bible that the Gothic heavy metal band in the novel is based on. And when Solomon died, Rehoboam inherited the kingdom. And the advisors came to him and they said, "Your father was a cruel man. And if you would lighten the burden on the people, we'll be loyal to you forever." And Rehoboam's response just epitomizes the relationship between him and his father. And what he says literally is, "My pinky is bigger than my father's penis." If you think that he was bad, wait till you get a load of me. He beat you with whips. I'm going to sting you with scorpions. Now, in that story, Rehoboam goes and he consults with the elders, the statesmen in his father's cabinet. And he says, "What do you think that I should do?" And they said, "Oh, well, you definitely need to lighten the load and make the people loyal to you." And then Rehoboam goes and he talks to the young men who are the drunken youths of the town who he associates with. And they're the ones that tell him, forget about those old guys. You've got to lay down the law and show them who's boss. So what you have with Rehoboam is he epitomizes the rebellious son. He despises his father. He follows the advice of the young drunkards over the counsel of his elders. And the outcome for the nation was that shortly after Rehoboam takes the throne, the kingdom of Israel is decimated, and he is left, instead of ruling over 12 tribes, he's left ruling over one. So there's a very clear message. And if you look at what the message of the story is, the message isn't that King Solomon was an example of biblical fatherhood who should be followed after. The message is that he was a very poor leader. So, if Christians, it's a sad fact that, I never get the chance to share this when I talk on, religious programs like Jesse Peterson's show and the many other radio shows that I've gone on that are religious. They don't want to hear about the Bible from an atheist.
Sure.
But very often it's the atheists that have taken the time to try to read and understand the book. And what you walk away with is that even if you're a religious person and you believe in the Bible, the exhortation to use physical discipline against your children is the advice of a king. It's not the advice of Christ. And King Solomon was not a prophet. And these religious institutions, when you go to their website and to me, if I open a website of a church or a book of a church and the first thing that they're saying about parenting is let's turn to the book of Proverbs, then you're talking about people that have very little understanding of what the scripture actually says. And they are teaching a tradition of a man, the traditions of Solomon they're presenting as being, part of their religion, but it was not a part of, anything that Christ taught. It's an Old Testament tradition.
Sure. Talk to me about child sacrifice 101 in the Bible. What is it? The Temple of Moloch?
Moloch I guess they describe him as one of the princes of the air. He's one of the kind of lieutenants of hell. In ancient times, it was a cult of human sacrifice. And the distinguishing factors with Moloch was that it is a a necessary element of the death that the victim suffer. And so the design over the centuries, there were various designs of the actual idol, but the most common was either an oven, a large clay oven it's a figure of a bull-headed god, which is the cover of the ebook right now, is the figure of Moloch. And they would place in the lower section, they would place grain, and then above a dove, and they would put a ewe, a lamb, and then at the top a human infant. It's a very slow, painful process. In the novel, the design for the idol, it appears in one of the big concert scenes as one of the set pieces for this Gothic heavy metal band, Rehoboam. The child is bound and placed onto the hands of the idol, and they describe it in the Bible as passing the child through the fire. And it's a practice of human sacrifice, but it's particularly designed to be very painful. So the thing with the connection here is King Solomon, he took so many foreign wives, and his foreign wives, some of them were worshipers of Moloch, and he was persuaded by them to actually build a temple that was visible from his palace. So King Solomon is in many Christian circles is the epitome of Christian parenting. It's his words on which they have based all of their advice about how to take care of children. And King Solomon actually built one of these idols for children to be burned alive, and positioned it on the highest hill above the temple that he built to Yahweh, so that the fire was visible from every corner of his land. So, Solomon was, according to the Bible, using no source but the Bible as your basis. You can find that King Solomon was anything but a godly person or an example of how people should behave towards children. So one of the other themes that's in the book, to lighten things just a bit, is I kind of grew up listening to heavy metal and to Gothic music, and I was, I don't know how old I was. I'm 40 now. When the Columbine murders took place, this was one of the first mass shootings in the United States that really caught the attention of the media. And at the time, there was a lot being made of the fact that these two kids were fans of the rock band Marilyn Manson.
Oh, sure.
And it's became a big controversy for the band, and this is an issue that I really wanted to take on. And so one of the other themes in the book that doesn't have to do, necessarily with physical abuse, is what is the relationship between musicians and their fans. And we have bands like Disturbed. The song Down with the Sickness is all about physical abuse, and they've got a whole bunch of other songs that deal with PTSD. You have songs from bands like Evanescence, you have songs from Korn, you have songs from Tool. So it really just struck me that there is this kind of whole area of music that is aimed at and directed at people who are victims of some kind of abuse, and that, the connection between these fans and the band is not that the band are introducing them to these ideas. They're actually, they have something in common. And so I really wanted to explore, just how sad it is in our society that someone can, make an album that's targeted at teenagers who are dealing with trauma, that are dealing with depression, that are dealing with abuse and severe physical, violence against them, or witnessing domestic violence, and that can be a marketable product that sells millions of copies is, to me, needs attention paid, but also at the same time, and I'm going to have to wrap up because I'm coming to the end of my time here, but also, the second issue about that is when you have children that are experiencing abuse, just like I did, they are very often feeling isolated and that nobody understands.
Sure.
And the first contact that I had with any other person who had experienced this was through listening to music and other artists who had taken and created poetry and music and this whole thing from their own experiences and use that to reach out to others. So one of the nice things for me in having written 1324 is that I have been able to have so many other survivors reaching out to me and saying, you have put into words what I would like to explain to my spouse about what it's like to live through this or to live with post-traumatic stress disorder. And, you know, people are saying you've put into words what it's like to struggle with your faith. You know, I think that, you know, the character Josh, as we go through the story, he goes from being the son of a pastor to being the lead singer of this gothic heavy metal band that is literally anti-Christian. And yet, though, it's not a continuous movement. There are fallbacks. In other words, in certain places, Josh is actually pulled back into the religion that he grew up in. When he reaches a crisis point, it still has a certain allure to come back to that, and that's something that, you know, I think doesn't get a lot these days. We have a lot of strong atheists, and that's great, but, you know, it really doesn't come across to a lot of people that, you know, leaving your religion is not a single step. No. It's not one decision. It's a process that's ongoing. And, you know, it's always something that you can be pulled back to.
You're always in remission.
Right, exactly. You're in remission until you're dead.
Right. So, hey, I want to ask you, because I was looking through the acknowledgments at the beginning of the book, and I saw that you thanked your dad.
Yeah, my dad was essentially a co-author on the book. So he and we didn't communicate for about 10 years. And then after if you go to Google, you'll find a story that I wrote about our first confrontation. I wrote an article about it. But, you know, my parents left that church when I was still quite young. I was about 8 when they left the church. And so a lot of the abuse just kind of never got dealt with.
Sure.
The family left and we moved on and things changed and there was no discussion. There was no debriefing about what had happened while we were attending that church. And so it kind of just came up later. I had a secondary trauma and I started to have a real, you know, mental health crisis. And in the midst of that, I reconnected with my father. And, you know, eventually we were on the phone probably 4 hours a day, every day for years. Right. Going through, he was the first one to read every chapter as it was written and, you know, contributed his thoughts and ideas to it. So, you know, that was something that
it sounds like he's taken some real ownership for what happened.
Well, you know, the thing of it is that, you know, he was really forced, you know, through a whole series of events. He was forced to really confront it. My dad was in the Army, served during Vietnam, and one of the psychologists that he went to see while all this abuse was still going on, my mother had taken my brother and I, and we left the state after a particularly bad beating. She took me and my brother, and we went literally to the other side of the country. And being that she was religious, she wasn't intending to divorce him or leave him, but she wanted to negotiate from a position of strength. So she went away. And she said, I will not return until you agree to get some help from someone who is not associated with that church.
Sure.
And, you know, the first therapist that he met, he says, you know, describe how are you punishing your kid? And at the end, the therapist tells my dad, what you described, if you did it to an enemy combatant in a war, it would be a crime under the Geneva Convention. It's torture. And, you know, it wasn't like a light bulb that went off that said, hey, this is wrong, but it was a thing that stayed at the back of his mind. And so over, you know, the next year and a half or 2 years, the abuse tapered off and then it was done. And really, my dad was left, you know, moving from the certainty of the church that tells you that this is the thing that you do, and that if it doesn't work, the only thing you can do is do it more and harder. He went to the other side completely, which is that he felt just so uncertain about how he should be with his kids that he kind of just became, you know, neglectful as opposed to abusive. My brother left home when he was 16, and I left home when I was around 15. And I had, you know, a couple of contacts with my dad, but from the time that I was 18 until I was about 28, we didn't speak at all.
Sure.
And so when we reconnected, he had a lot of time to kind of contemplate what had passed between us. And the odd thing is that when I first reconnected with him, he immediately wanted to apologize. And at that time, I really was not, I hadn't really started to delve into all of my memories of what happened. So I really was kind of not receptive to his apology. It's always a hard thing for me to decide how much responsibility goes to the church and how much responsibility goes to the parent.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that for a certain amount of time, it's always tempting to blame the church in order to rescue the relationship with the parent.
Right.
And, that's not the right thing to do. But, the other side of that is to lay all the blame on the parent and to not acknowledge that, they were in the middle of a cult where everyone was doing the same thing. And so, they really were not acting as they would have had they been somewhere else. Which I can remember being in church in my adult years. There was a brief period, about 2 or 3 years, that I was still attending church. I remember, hearing something I didn't like, and the pastor says to me, God brought you to this church for a reason, and if you leave this church, then you will be walking off of the path, and you may never find your way back. And,
Mm-hmm.
It's really a horrible thing, but this is essentially what happened with our family, is that my parents went into this church, and right away my mother felt that the way that they were dealing with discipline and children was wrong.
Yeah.
However, what happens, I think, is there's a sense that if you start shopping for a church that says what you like, then is there really any ultimate truth? If you just go in and they say something and you don't like it and you leave, so you wind up where it's almost like random chance. You spin the bottle and walk into a church and you say to yourself, this must be the right church because this is the one that I walked into. The religious leader is an expert at getting people to accept, his way of thinking and his, way of looking at the world. And I think that, there's a mitigating factor, for parents that are involved in that, provided that at some point they do, catch on and take responsibility. To me, the thing that's very sad is how many people who contact me who are fans of my writing, whose parents are still in the cult and are not taking responsibility. And, it's very hard when your church and your family are telling you that you are the one who is wrong, that you should understand what they did, and you should be understanding and realize that they had your best interests at heart, regardless of how harmful you actually considered it to be.
People don't like taking responsibility in general. And it's, as you already know, it's very rare to actually get an abuser to give you an apology, if not more than one apology. So I guess that might be a positive note on how to end.
Yeah, how do you end on a positive note? Here's what
I think that's a positive way, man, because a lot of people don't get that apology. A lot of people don't keep that relationship with an abusive parent.
Well, though, it's just like any cult. Okay, if you get into a cult, when you first meet them, they present a acceptable doctrine that looks as much as possible like mainstream Christianity. That's how they lure people in. And by the time that you get deep enough into it to realize that this group is insane, you have already given up your money, you've given up your family, you've spent so much time going around and proselytizing, you've made public declarations, of the worthiness of this group. And so by the time you know what you've gotten into, they really have you in a position where it's extremely embarrassing and expensive to turn around and say that you were wrong. And if you can imagine, if you had literally physically abused and tortured your own children, how hard it is to acknowledge that that is the fact, and how much easier it is to say that your children have just become under the influence of groups that are telling them that they've been abused when really there was nothing done that was wrong. It's very hard for parents, who have been lured into these groups and have been made an unwitting accomplice in brainwashing their kid. I think it's hard for them to let go.
Sure.
But, to me, what I came to after looking at all of the different angles and what everyone was doing is that what needs to be is that, I need everyone that is listening to this to go to Amazon.com and get a copy of my novel. It's 1324, A Story of Faith and Obsession. It's a mystery thriller, and it is very exciting and interesting to read. And I need, in order to explain what happened and how it affects victims and what to do about it, it needs 100,000 words. I can't do it. I can't do it in a 15-minute, talk on the radio, and I can't do it in a 1,500-word essay. Yeah. I need your time and attention for long enough to really expose the full sense of what it is. And then after reading, I need people to go out and use the information that they've gained to persuade others, to persuade politicians. It does no good to have a law about physical abuse when the jury that hears the case is coming to the case with all of their knowledge and information coming from their pastor.
Yeah.
And, there are scientific issues that are involved. There's psychological issues that are involved. There's all of these areas. But just like if you're arguing evolution with a person who is religious, all of their facts about evolution are coming from chick tracts and information that they're getting from their pastor. So they believe that they have seen evidence that tells them that this is correct. And you need to be armed in order to overcome that. So what I've tried to do with the novel is to take like the first semester of an abnormal psychology class and the first semester of, a biblical exegesis of what the Old Testament actually says about this, and, combine it into something where it's not like slogging through a textbook. The novel now is on Kindle Unlimited, which means that you can read it for free if you are a subscriber, or right now this week it's 99 cents on the Kindle store.
Oh, you beat me to it. I was going to say that.
But listen, I don't make any money. Everyone says, why don't you give it away? If you want everyone to read it and you're not making money, why don't you give it away for free? And the reason is that I actually generate hundreds of dollars a year of royalties from the sales of that book. And because it's a novel, the book has been the #1 bestseller on the Amazon's charts for child abuse, for dysfunctional families. It was up as high as number 43 on the crime thrillers chart. Currently, it's in the top 10 on the Kindle ebook store. This week, it'll be in the top 10 as we're selling them for 99 cents. But I have the opportunity to use so many marketing avenues that you cannot do with nonfiction. And about 90% of the people that I'm reaching with my book are not other activists. They're not people that have an interest in this as a subject. They're just people who like to read crime thrillers, who enjoy mystery. So I'm accessing a huge audience of people. And, what's needed to do that kind of outreach, we sent out almost 1 million emails to reach out to potential readers to get that book up into the top pages on the charts on Amazon and get attention for it. It costs money to run those advertisements, and all throughout the year I run ads on Amazon that reach out to readers of books like V.C. Andrews writes lots and lots of books about incest and child abuse, and V.C. Andrews readers read my book. And I can reach out to, I mine looking for groups of readers that might be interested in using targeted advertising to get my message in front of them and to reach. It occurred to me years ago that so much research is being done and so much knowledge is being gained on these subjects, but the general public are continuing to get so much of their information about child abuse from a pulpit.
Yeah.
And as long as we are allowing pastors to control the discussion, you're never going to see any progress on this issue, because the people are taking the word of a pastor as being authoritative. But if you look scientifically, the church is as ignorant about child abuse and what causes it and how it affects people as they are ignorant, as the Bible is ignorant of astronomy and, physics. They literally just are the blind leading the blind, because the source of their information is, a text that was written by, sheep herders 5,000 years ago. there's no, but this information has been repeated and repeated so often that people take it to be a known fact. It isn't a known fact. It's a made up rumor that is spread. And, the antidote is that we need more truth. Now, I would say to those who are not interested in reading a mystery thriller, you can pick up a book by a colleague of mine. Her name is Janet Heimlich, and the book is called Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. And that book is an excellent nonfiction treatment that goes into a lot of the same details. And also, people can jump on to the web and they can Google my name. It's M. Dolon Hickmon, and it's all O's and no A's. MDOLON HICKMON. And if you Google my name, you're going to find a bunch of articles that I've written for thehumanist.com, for the Freethinker, and you'll find the interview that was done with me for Publishers Weekly back when the book came out, and lots of other stuff, information that goes into, the areas where the church is failing young Christians who are sitting in the pew, and they need to get a message from their church and from their community that being whipped and beaten to the point that it's, causing physical or mental harm is not part of being a Christian, and it's not part of being an obedient child. It's something that's wrong, and it needs to, you need to seek help if that's the situation that you're in. And also, a lot of survivors that are in the same position that I was in, where they feel that they are alone and they're the only one and no one understands. I have so many people tell me after reading my novel, they gave it to their spouse or to their boss or to their sister, and they said, "This is me. If you've been wondering why I act the way that I do, this book explains what I can't explain." So, April is National Child Abuse Prevention Month, and I hope that if you've got an airplane flight or a train ride or a couple of minutes that you're going to be sitting still and not doing anything, we need a smarter electorate. We need a smarter public, and we can't. Victims of serious abuse are not a politically potent group. We're less than 1 in 1,000, and we rely on people who have not had the same experience as us to take our case and present it to politicians and present it to the media. And so, even if none of this applies to you or your family situation, I would just really implore everybody who's listening, whether you pick up my book or you pick up Janet Heimlich's book or you do some research online, look into it and, get knowledgeable enough about it, because I don't know when you'll have the chance to put that knowledge to use, but I know that you will at some point.
I will give you a godless amen to that. It was great having you on, man.
Well, it was awesome to be on the show, and I look forward to continuing to listen. I enjoyed listening to Jex Blackmore on here and all kinds of other cool guests. You guys are doing a great job, and it's funny and fun, and I look forward to continuing to be a fan.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again.
All right. Bye-bye, guys.
Take care. Bye.